My name is Mo Amir, and this is VANCOLOUR, British Columbia's bona fide culture and politics TV talk show right here on Check and Check Plus. We're also on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Tonight, we have a very special show for you as we're dedicating the entire program to our blockbuster guest. She is a former BC Crown prosecutor who served as the twice-elected Member of Parliament for Vancouver Granville from 2015 to 2021. The former Attorney General and Minister of Justice for Canada and a former Regional Chief of the BC Assembly of First Nations, her political memoir, Indian in the Cabinet, is now available wherever books are sold. She is the Honorable Jody Wilson-Raybould. Jody.
Wow, blockbuster. That's a
what
pretty
an honor.
Thank you for having me back. And I appreciate it.
It's a pleasure to see you. I have to ask you right off the bat, though.
Yeah.
In your book, Indian in the Cabinet, in the prologue, you talk about this meeting that you had with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau at the Fairmont Pacific Rim. And it's just the two of you. And at some point, I think at the start of the meeting, he walks up to a sculpture or a statue in the middle of the room, and he chops at it and punches at it as if he's like shadow boxing. Did this happen? Is that real?
I did write about that. That is true. It looked like it was plastic, and it turned out to be. It looked like it was glass, and it turned out to be.
That's weird,
plastic.
right?
I was a little taken aback given the serious reality of the meeting that we were having. So, yeah, it was weird.
Yeah. Is this one of the things where if he's presented with this, he's going to say that, this is just something that happens where two people can experience the same event very differently?
Well, I've never ascribed to that description about people experiencing things differently. In fact, I have a T-shirt that rebuts that.
What is the rebuttal?
It's actually kind of making fun of it. It just says I experience things differently, and it just says no or something like that on it. But I don't know. I don't know. I don't know if the Prime Minister has even read this book.
He's read it, I'm sure.
Yeah, maybe.
So the book, Indian in the Cabinet, it's really the self-discovery and your journey of realizing that this Trudeau Liberal Party promise of doing politics differently is a sham. And one of the things that really stood out to me is when you stood up in the House of Commons, I believe it was February 20th, 2019.
Privilege and confidentiality are not mine to waive, and I hope that I have the opportunity to speak my truth.
It was a very powerful moment in Canadian politics. And afterwards, you texted your husband, Tim, and you had a back and forth with him. And you texted him, and I want to get this quote correct. You said, "I am just tired of f***ing around." Is that kind of the problem with the Trudeau government, that they promise these transformative changes, but when you look at their actions, ultimately they're just kind of f***ing around?
Well, a number of things. My mother doesn't like the swear words in my book, but that is exactly verbatim the text that I sent to Tim. I think we need to contextualize it. That was a day where I did stand up in the House. This was in the throes of the SNC-Lavalin scandal. Mm-hmm. I had been going through weeks of back and forth, and I was at that point imploring the government to do the right thing, which in my mind was to tell the truth and to start to remedy the challenges that have been presented in terms of SNC and prosecution. I was kind of fed up, and I just stood up in front of what you say is the nation in the House of Commons and said that I wanted to speak. So that's how I felt in that moment. Mm-hmm. There were other moments that I felt that way, but to cast that as a reflection of my feelings about the entirety of my government experience is not the case. I truly still believe in doing politics differently. Mm-hmm. That's why I signed up from my experiences. But Indian in the Cabinet tells of my experience being an Indigenous leader, going into mainstream federal politics, and telling the stories and my experience for other people to learn from. Mm-hmm. Things changed over time with the government that I was a part of. Promises fell off the table. Mm-hmm. The reality of saying we're going to do politics differently actually didn't turn out to be what we did. There were a lot of falling back into patterns of hyperpartisanship and politics by polls, that type of thing. And that for me was incredibly frustrating.
One of the things that really surprised me in the book was how open you were about actively being discouraged from carrying out your mandate as the Attorney General and Minister of Justice. And you bring up this one example where obviously you are very committed to moving forward on the files of minimum mandatory penalties and other Indigenous rights issues. And at one point, a official in the Prime Minister's office comes to you and says, no, we can't work on these justice issues because the Prime Minister just embarrassed himself in India. And I'm obviously scratching my head thinking, how are those two things related? But it almost felt like one of your indictments is that this government and the Prime Minister himself cared about brand above all else, including fulfilling promises. Mm-hmm. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, I mean, I think of it in a number of ways. I mean, I understand politics and I understand the reality of branding. I mean, I was a member of the Liberal Party. I think what frustrates me, and it wasn't always the case, I mean, as a government in the beginning, we did do a lot of substantive things, game changers that have transformed the country, whether that be in terms of medical assistance in dying or cannabis and other justice-related things that I was involved in. But over time, I found that the branding or making decisions based on what the polls say came into being more prevalent in our discussions. And I think, I think that's wrong. And I think that it is the responsibility of people who are elected, if they make promises, to fulfill those promises and do what they say they were going to do, right, and be able to separate the reality and the responsibility of leadership and make decisions and not just be focused on branding or what you look like or getting reelected. That's problematic, and that's the distinction that we need to make in terms of people that we put and trust in leadership roles.
You also write about how executive control is really quite centralized in the Prime Minister's office, often with people who are unelected. You talk about being the Attorney General and Minister of Justice, but not having a direct line to the Prime Minister. You talk about relationships within cabinet being controlled by the Prime Minister's office. And you talk about how you were effectively gaslit just for trying to pursue your office's mandate, the mandate that your government was elected on. How much of your frustration is directed towards the actual people in those offices, in the Prime Minister's office? And I'm talking about Katie Telford and Jerry Butts and, of course, the Prime Minister himself. And how much of it is just the structure of how the executive branch is in the Canadian parliamentary system?
Yeah, I mean, I do not have any frustration towards individual people. I mean, the reality of what I experience, and I imagine this is the experience of many ministers in the past, and including when I was in government, other ministers, that centralization of control in unelected people is wrong for our democracy. The implications of that for our democracy are vast, and we have to be vigilant about how and understand how decisions are being made. So yeah, it frustrated me. I wanted to have conversations with my colleagues. I wanted to be able to, as the Attorney General, to call the Prime Minister when an issue came about and not have to go through 10 days of trying to get a meeting, as an example. But this is a question about the systemic realities in our institutions and how power can be galvanized between and among unelected people in the Prime Minister's office, and how we think about that, if that's a good thing. I don't think it is. And we need to put in place measures of transparency and accountability that don't necessarily exist, but in this case, what this government promised but didn't follow through with.
Right.
And for me, as the Attorney General, when SNC came about, that was an issue. It was somewhat different because I had the legal authority to make the decisions irrespective of what anybody else had said to me. That's where the pressure came. That's what I talk about in the book. But those other decisions. I mean, imagine people sitting around a table having discussions and not necessarily having any accountability around it. And this is talking about cabinet confidences, which I understand the need for.
Yeah.
But how far does that cabinet confidentiality go in terms of potentially making bad decisions or making decisions that are not necessarily appropriate or where wrongdoing can happen? We need to recognize and understand that reality.
Right. And I think that's an excellent assessment of how things are structured in the parliamentary system. But a little frustration with the Prime Minister?
Well, I'm frustrated in the fact that we could have done so much more. Like, the promises that were made were entirely achievable with a huge amount of hard work.
Yeah.
The problem with our democratic system and the centralization of power or lack of transparency and accountability is that individual members of parliament, backbenchers, are cast aside or pushed away and only used for their votes, and they vote along party lines. So there's a lot of things that need to be deconstructed or looked at in a way that actually recognizes how decisions are being made and how individual members of parliament are essentially being left out of that decision-making process.
Well, Jody, I have so many more questions.
Okay.
Folks, stick around because after some business, Jody Wilson-Raybould will be here to discuss some of the systemic issues plaguing our nation's governance. And I'm going to ask her the big question. Is she going to run to be the next mayor of Vancouver? I'm Mo Amir. This is VANCOLOUR. Welcome back to This is VANCOLOUR. My name is Mo Amir, and as promised, I'm back with our featured guest today, lawyer, author of the political memoir Indian in the Cabinet, and of course, the former Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, Jody Wilson-Raybould. Jody, thanks for sticking around.
Yeah, a pleasure.
So something happened at the end of the last, I guess, legislative session before the election.
Lots happened.
Something happened that kind of caught my attention, and it was a former colleague of yours, the former NDP MP for Nunavut, Momolak Kakak. She gave this really emotive speech about how the House of Commons was not a welcoming place and how she experienced systemic racism and discrimination. And as I was reading your book, you even say that you put up with racism and misogyny. And by no fault of your own, it kind of broke my heart because I thought about how you, as this high-profile cabinet minister, would face that. And if you're facing that, then what about someone who has lesser profile who's entering the halls of power?
Yeah, I mean, a number of things, but I mean, in terms of profile, it does. I believe it doesn't matter what table you sit around or with what perceived level of power, influence, and authority. Marginalization, racism, and discrimination can still carry with you.
Sure.
So like the rest of the country, I'm hearing Momolak, and she's very articulate. She's an amazing person. I have nothing but respect for her. Speak those words about the systemic racism that she that are contained within the walls of Parliament. And what she experienced personally, it does break my heart. But at the same time, thank goodness for Momolak being there. And I would say my experience in Parliament was worthwhile. Yes, there is systemic racism. The halls and the walls and the procedures in the House of Commons are based on the experiences of many people that don't look like me, white, older men, to be frank, and the experiences or how we conduct business and how we make decisions isn't necessarily welcoming to people of different worldviews. And I'll give you an example of something that confronted me almost on a daily basis. I would walk into my office at the Department of Justice. I'd walk past the photographs of all the previous justice ministers, all of whom were older men. And it wasn't until Kim Campbell and then Anne McClellan that we saw women, and my being the first or indigenous person, marginalized person being in that role. Yes, you experience that. And the people, whether it be your cabinet colleagues, the prime minister or otherwise, embracing different ways of thinking, different lived experiences is something that people who have held power in certain ways for so long, maybe they don't necessarily realize it needs to change or are satisfied with the status quo.
Right.
So we continue to face that. I'm sure you face that in your life in certain respects, being somebody, a person of color. But yeah, it exists everywhere. And I guess I would say for all the Mumalaks of the world or people that want to run, I don't want my book or anything I say to be a discouragement from running. Mm-hmm. The only way we're going to break down the systemic racism and the barriers that exist and change the way we make decisions is if people continue to be involved. So it's kind of a call to action to continue to run for various offices, no matter what they are. And I certainly haven't sworn off going back into that place because we need to change it. And sometimes
I'm sure a lot of people will be happy to hear that. One thing you point out is that the Canadian system of governance doesn't really have the institutions to investigate alleged government misconduct. When I read that, my mind automatically thought, well, if they don't have the institutions to properly investigate it, then government misconduct must be rampant because people know that they can get away with it.
Well, I mean, it touches on something we talked a little bit about earlier in the sense, and I talk about this in the author's note in the book. I, as a cabinet minister, I'm still a privy councillor, have to take oaths and swear allegiance. And there's something called cabinet confidentiality. The challenge that I found being at the center of power or government is that, we have committees, we can investigate things through committees, but the power is centralized around the cabinet table and certainly centralized with the prime minister in the prime minister's office. And there aren't necessarily any checks and balances on how those decisions are made because of the oaths that we take, because of the confidences that ministers have. And don't get me wrong, cabinet confidences are important in order to make decisions and take in account various pieces of information. But at the same time, accountability and transparency is important. So what happened to me as the Attorney General, had I not spoken out about it and expressed my concern around the challenges that the rule of law was facing and the independence of the prosecution, that would have just gone away and nobody would have known about it. Right. How many times has that happened in our country? And I say this in the book, 5 times, 10 times, 100 times. We don't know, but I think it's an important conversation for us to be mindful of and to continue to have discussions around in terms of the responsibilities of our elected people, particularly the ones that are making the decisions that have an impact on all of our lives.
Absolutely. Really quick question. You and I run in some of the similar circles. We obviously hear the same whispers here and there. I keep hearing that you're going to run for the mayorship of Vancouver. Is this true? Are you running to be the next mayor of Vancouver?
I don't have plans to run to be the next mayor of Vancouver. But I honestly have had many people ask me to and encourage me to. I love this city. I think the office of the mayor is an incredibly important responsibility, but that's not in the cards for me.
I feel like a lot of dudes in particular are breathing a nice sigh of relief when they hear that.
Well,
and we know who those dudes are. Yeah. Jody, when we come back, we're going to play a game. Okay, you're going to stick around?
I'll play a game.
All right, sounds good. Folks, stick around because Jody Wilson-Raybould is not going anywhere. And after we return from commercial break, she is going to settle the super serious debates about the super serious things. Jody Wilson-Raybould plays Well Actually Rapid Fire up next. My name is Mo Amir. This is VANCOLOUR. Welcome back to This is VANCOLOUR. My name is Mo Amir, and if you're familiar with the show, you know that from time to time, my partner in Thought Crime, Katie Merrifield, and I like to end the program with a segment that we call, Well Actually, a super serious debate about the super serious things. But we're not going to do that this week. Instead, we're going to take those super serious debate questions directly to our featured guest today, Jody Wilson-Raybould, and she will make the final definitive ruling on each of these super controversial, super divisive, and super important issues. Whatever Jody says will henceforth be the correct answer, and she is being advised that she must pick an answer. No maybes, no middle grounds. Jody, you understand the rules and the responsibility of being the supreme judge of these questions?
I'm a bit scared about it.
Well, let's begin. Let's just dive into this. Which of these two ocean animals is the best? Dolphins or sharks?
Oh, goodness. I think that I would have to say sharks.
Okay, sharks. Which of these two treats should become Canada's national dessert? Timbits or beaver tails?
Oh my gosh. I've had beaver tails. I haven't had the Timbits, so I'm going to go with beaver tails.
Wow. So you're not a fan of Justin Bieber is what you're saying on the record.
If you ask me one of his songs that he sings, I don't think I could name one. So
This is breaking news.
I think it's fantastic how he's translated that into Tim Hortons. So that's pretty good.
Okay, next question. Are New Year's resolutions the best or the worst?
I am not a big New Year's resolution person, so I guess I would be saying they're the worst.
Wow. Wow. Is soup a meal? Yes or no?
Absolutely.
What is the best pet? Cats or dogs?
My mother-in-law will hate me, but for me, dogs. I love dogs. I always have.
Do you have any dogs?
I don't have any pets right now, but I have had dogs in the past.
Jody, I appreciate this so much. Thank you for your time. Thanks for playing along. And thanks for bringing your candid self, as always, to This is VANCOLOUR.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Folks, that's our show. This is VANCOLOUR. We'll be back next week right here on Check and Check Plus, Sundays at 7 p.m. Find This is VANCOLOUR wherever you listen to your podcasts if you want to check out the full interview. Thank you to the powerful Jody Wilson-Raybould for putting in the full shift tonight, and make sure you catch her book, Indian in the Cabinet, available wherever you buy or read your books. This is VANCOLOUR. I'm Mo Amir, telling you that in a province where you can be anything, be colorful. Peace.